Welcome, everybody. It's marvellous to see you here today, and the sun's shining on us. It's a great day. And welcome to all the people who are watching online, and I know there are many of them as well. We're absolutely thrilled to welcome David Olusoga as part of our 2021 Wordfest programme, and we're very grateful to David for honouring his agreement that he gave to us way back in 2019 to come to Shoreham Wordfest. David, as you know, is one of the UK's foremost historians and was awarded an OBE for his services to history and community engagement. He's an author, broadcaster, and increasingly a public commentator. In his writing and his documentaries, he's encouraged us to explore the history all around us and to uncover the stories of those deemed unimportant. We've asked David to address the topic of culture wars, which is a hot topic at the moment, challenging the recent backlash against attempts to revisit the historical legacy of Britain's imperial past, despite the continuing racism and inequality experienced by many. The challenge has particularly come from senior voices in government recently. Oliver Dowden, you may have heard at the Conservative Party conference just recently, said, "Go woke, go broke," challenging those organisations like the British Museum and the National Trust that have tried to look at the history of the artefacts that they have there and just challenge some of the views that they've been in the past, threatening them with the reduction of funding if they carry on. David recently wrote, "My job is to be a historian. It is not to make people feel good. People have decided that their national myths are so important they don't care about truth." So the title of his talk today is The Job of a Historian. David has been busily signing books since he arrived, and there will be more signed copies afterwards if you haven't already got your books. David will talk for about 35 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. So can you please welcome David Olusoga.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I was supposed to be here a year ago, but 18 months ago, a lot of us had plans that didn't really pan out the way that we'd imagined. It's amazing to see so many people come out to hear someone speak who's dedicated to not making them feel good. So I feel very reassured about that. At the beginning of this year, I wrote a newspaper article making a prediction. Historians traditionally don't like to make predictions. It's not something I'm in the habit of doing. What I predicted was that in 2021, historians and parts of our history would be the central targets in our increasingly unpleasant, confected culture wars. Now, this in truth was not much of a prediction. All it was an extrapolation of what had happened in 2020. And for many people, had identified the trends over the preceding 12 months. Now, a lot of what's happened in this country over the past 18, 19 months since the murder of George Floyd has been around history, and that is something I think future generations and future historians are going to ask us questions about and are going to note. But as we enter the last months of 2021, that prediction that I made in January has proved more accurate than I feared at the time, as our so-called culture wars have mutated into history wars and into statue wars. Throughout my career, making TV programs and writing books, I've been drawn primarily to two forms of history. The first is the history of working class people like my mother's Scottish and English ancestors. I was brought up in a council estate by the Tyne, opposite Newcastle in the town of Gateshead. My ancestors worked in that city, in that region, and they worked in factories in Glasgow in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Their histories and the history of people like them have always been special to me. A few weeks ago, I was in the Office for National Statistics headquarters, and they are preparing to release the 1921 census. And they had prepared for me my grandfather and my grandmother's entries in the census. in the little houses in Gateshead that they lived in, including a house that I lived in briefly when I first came to this country, and it was immensely powerful to see the signature of my great-grandfather, to see my grandmother registered as a girl of 6. My grandfather is a 16-year-old apprentice, already working as an engineer, as he would for the rest of his life. When I studied urban history for my second degree, what fascinated me again was the history of people like them. I was drawn to the story of the Victorian slums, the lives and the suffering of the people at the very bottom of society. The other form of history I've always been connected to is the history of the empire, as it's that history that explains the backstories of millions of people in Britain who, like myself, are immigrants or the children of immigrants. The history of the empire explains how my mother's Scottish and English family from the northeast of England and the centre of Scotland eventually encountered someone from my father's family from southern Nigeria. And in both of those areas of history, the lives of poor working class people and black people and other people of colour who encountered British power in the form and the shape of the empire, I've wanted to tell and explore stories that were not well known, histories that were concealed or otherwise just simply forgotten. But now, all of a sudden, in the past 3-4 years, 2 decades into my career, doing what I've always done has suddenly become enormously political and contentious. Suddenly, uncovering one of those concealed histories from one of my areas of interest, but not the other, is no longer seen by some as an act of public history, but an assault upon the nation of which I'm a citizen. Something very deeply has changed. But the culture wars and the history wars, we have to be clear, are not an attack on the whole of history. They are a targeted strike on very specific arenas of historical research and public history, on what is defined by some as contested histories and contested heritages. And to take those terms, contested history, contested heritage, and the way they're being used by journalists and by politicians, they are very, very different from the way historians might deploy those words. And in all of this is a key phrase, our history, which raises huge questions about who we are, who enjoy our history, and who they are, who are not part of our history. The great controversies and debates that over the decades have divided historians, sometimes very bitterly, historians are quite well known for falling out with one another over aspects of the past. That's what Newman and Baddiel made great fun of 20 years ago, historians having these deep feuds about things that very few other people really care about. Those debates, those forms of contested history do not register in the new history wars. Let's take one of my specialisms, the First World War. The causes of the First World War, the quality or otherwise of British military leadership and British military tactics during that conflict, the infamous lions led by donkeys debate, those are all aspects of British history that have been contested for decades, around which historians hold strongly differing views. But that's not what is meant by contested in this new culture war definition. And historians engaged in those debates don't find themselves on the pages of tabloid newspapers. The museums and the heritage organisations that explore those controversies, although controversial among historians and heritage professionals, don't have their funding threatened. This is very specific. Only certain forms of history fall into what we might call contested and are the subject of these history wars. Let me give you an example from my own work that I think, illustrates how narrowly focused this so-called culture war and history wars are. So I present a series on the BBC that some of you might have seen called A House Through Time. And over 4 series, that's 16 hours of television, we've explored the lives of people who lived in 4 houses in 4 British cities: Liverpool, Newcastle, Bristol, and most recently, Leeds. The stories of the ordinary lives lived in those ordinary houses are unearthed by a brilliant team of researchers and producers that I get the honour to work with. And those histories of the residents of those houses stretch from the early 18th century right up to the present day. They involve hundreds of residents living at various positions within the strata of Georgian, Victorian, and 20th century British society, and inevitably, obviously, unavoidably, there are tragic as well as uplifting stories. Among the subjects over those 4 series that we have explored have been domestic violence, child abuse, a suspected suicide, bigamy twice, petty crime, prostitution, the abandonment of children. The people who have lived in those 4 houses in those 4 cities have died of cholera, of tuberculosis, of syphilis, of rickets. One 20th century resident in Liverpool tragically died of HIV. And the houses we've explored have been home to women who have been widowed in the First World War and people bombed out of other houses who found refuge in our houses during the Second World War. We have, with some of these storylines, worried and asked ourselves questions about whether audiences and reviewers might worry that we've crossed a line, that aspects of the past are perhaps too raw, too visceral to be explored on a history program on television. I've asked myself whether stories relating to child mortality, an inevitable, unavoidable aspect of the lives of people living in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, was maybe too much for television. But it turns out we shouldn't have worried. Our audiences and the television reviewers have shown remarkable resilience to harsh realities about the lives that our ancestors lived in earlier centuries. And we've been constantly and pleasantly surprised at the appetite that exists for acknowledging, for confronting those realities. Over 4 series, we've never received a complaint or read a review that suggested that any story we've tackled was too harsh, too negative, too sensitive, too divisive. There's been no suggestion that any of those issues should have been set aside or ignored. Just one subject, in all of those hours of television, among all of the lives we've explored, has drawn criticism of reviewers and complaints from members of the audience. That one subject came in the series in Bristol, when, completely unsurprisingly, a house built in the early 18th century, very near to the city's docks, had been home to a series of merchants who, in various ways and to various degrees, had been involved in the Atlantic slave trade and the ancillary trades and businesses that emerged around it. The wars and the diseases that had killed literally millions of our ancestors, the domestic tragedies that cast shadows over their lives, all of that was acceptable, all of that was legitimate. None of it was regarded as too negative, too divisive. The housing crisis of the early 20th century, the slums between the wars, the crippling unemployment of the Depression years, none of that was said to be talking down the country or rewriting history or making people feel ashamed about their history. Only slavery was a step too far. Those who are leading our history wars, the history warriors you might call them, who seek to silence historians and threaten heritage organisations, claim that they are fighting to defend British history against those who are motivated for reasons that are never fully explained by a desire to make us feel shame about our history. They claim that this is about shame or pride, about historians talking down Britain, about the misapplication of critical theory to the past. Yet crimes, abuses, defeats, fatal incompetence, lethal misjudgments from the past, all of them, no matter the human cost, as long as they don't connect in any way to slavery, empire, or other aspects of the past that we have traditionally been uncomfortable with, all of that doesn't seem to trigger the hair trigger of the history warriors. Those histories alone, we are told, should simply be abandoned. The linkages between British cities, companies, buildings, our culture, and the wealth of the nation, and those phenomena should be left unexamined. Attacking historians who dare to examine the role of slavery or imperialism in the creation of Britain's national wealth or our culture conveniently creates new enemies who can be paraded before the people. When the historians in question turn out to be women, as was the case with the National Trust's Colonial Countryside project, then the attacks, it's hard not to notice, have become even more personal and at times hysterical. But what is under assault here is not just individuals, though for those individuals, what has happened has been appalling and damaging, but academic curiosity itself, the lifeblood of academic scholarship, that is now being portrayed rather than being the work of historians or the work of heritage professionals that has carried on for decades. It is now being misrepresented as a form of cultural treason, or misrepresented as a form of politicization of history. Recent attacks on historians, museums, universities, and the National Trust were launched not so much to win arguments or to influence the shape of historical debates, but to intimidate other historians, other universities, other heritage organizations, to not even consider or to abandon efforts that they might have been considering to investigate other parts of Britain's past that they might be connected to. This is a war against facts. This is a flight from reason. This is the cult of incuriosity. This is anti-history. The history warrior's aim is to convince people that they are being oppressed by irrefutable facts about their own national histories, that shared histories, like slavery and empire, are in fact assaults upon British history rather than part of British history, attacks on British identity rather than an aspect of Britain's identity. They seek to suggest that honesty about our past should be surrendered to the maintenance of myths, and that historians and people who work in the heritage industry, people who have committed their professional lives to the study of the past, people who have dedicated themselves to making that knowledge more publicly accessible, are enemies within, that they are part of woke mobs, that they are militants. The history wars are a campaign to maintain an exceptionalist mythology around English and British history that has long excluded the histories of empire and slavery. Despite the language used in the tabloids and by politicians, the new history wars have nothing to do with what is divisive. And historians who've dedicated their lives to those branches of historical study are not people who, as they are accused of doing, hate our history. This is a slander against some of our greatest historians, some of our most valued institutions. The same newspapers accuse young people of being snowflakes, and yet they are closed to the content of chapters of Britain's past that they regard as unnecessary or traumatic. They accuse young people of being closed to new ideas, unwilling to face uncomfortable facts, and yet they argue that when it comes to empire and slavery, we as a nation are just better off not knowing. Earlier this year, the MP Marco Longhi, speaking about the National Trust and its long-term project to draw out those linkages between the properties under its care and the histories of empire, slavery, and the East India Company, said this in an interview, and I quote, "Why do we need to be told by the National Trust that we have those links? You know, it seems to me that they have an agenda to make us feel guilty about our past." To me, that's an astonishing thing to say in multiple ways. Who is us and who is not us? What is our past? What is not our past? And there is no attempt here to deny that those links are real, that they are part of British history. Mr. Longhi was not claiming that these linkages to empire and slavery are fake history. We have those links, he admits. What is being proposed here by our leaders, by newspapers, by journalists, is that we should choose to be willfully ignorant about aspects of British history, and that those who desire such ignorance reserve the right to engage in attacks on those dedicated to uncovering and acknowledging aspects of British past that they seem not to like. This is a call for unknowing, an evocation to ignorance, a clarion call for a culture of incuriosity. It is diametrically opposed to everything the study of history should be: courageous, inquiring, and honest. It is also, in ways that are too obvious to state, literally Orwellian. Many arguments are marshalled to legitimize the silencing of these histories. The study of black history and the study of empire are routinely now described as being political, and as such, illegitimate. Whereas the study of the history of politics is not described as being political. Just as what I'm saying now will be deemed to be political. Part of the process involves the rebranding of historical research as activism and the redesignation of historians, not as historians, but as activists. Another argument used to silence aspects of the past that they are uncomfortable with is to suggest that the discussion of slavery or empire traps 21st century black Britons in what is called a culture of victimhood. It's not, they suggest, that discussing how Britain trafficked millions of Africans into slavery makes them feel uncomfortable, merely that they worry about the emotional health of black people. At other times, they argue that the money being spent on research into historical linkages between modern institutions and these forbidden histories could and should be spent instead on increasing the diversity and inclusion of the organizations embarking upon such research. Why dwell in the past, they say? We should look to the future. Yet, why are those two options proposed as a binary choice, one or the other? Is it not possible for companies, corporations, universities, charities to carry out research, rigorous investigations into their history, into their linkages to empire and slavery, into the sources of their wealth, at the same time putting in place systems to address modern inequalities of diversity and inclusion? Why choose those two courses of action and suggest that there is a false dichotomy between them? Why is it a case of either or? It might perhaps, though probably not, be of a little comfort to remember that this is not just happening in the United Kingdom. At the start of this year, President Biden cancelled the 1776 Commission, a Trump-era historical project. With a single flick of the presidential pen rather than a Sharpie, it was brought to an end. The commission was so named, because it was named after the year of the Declaration of Independence, and it was the Trump administration's response to the award-winning, Pulitzer-winning New York Times project, the 1619 Project. That was a series of articles by academics, historians, and journalists that attempted to place slavery and the experiences of African Americans at the center of America's history. The 1776 Commission's report that was published provocatively and intentionally on Martin Luther King Day concluded that the cause of racial division in America today is not the legacy of slavery or the legacy of a century of Jim Crow segregation enforced with lynching and other forms of violence, or the vast and continuing disparities in incomes, wealth, opportunities, and the treatment by law enforcement that mean that African Americans have on average 10% of the wealth of white families. That's not the cause, according to the 1776 Commission, of division within America today. It is the teaching of that history in American schools and colleges. The 1776 report made a case for the abandoning of those aspects of American history and its replacement with what the authors called, quote, patriotic education. When I was growing up in the 1980s, that's the sort of phrase that was associated with the Soviet Union and the nations that struggled under its yoke. The 1776 report was, thankfully, condemned by many historians. The American Historical Association accused the Commission of seeking, quote, to elevate ignorance about the past as a civic virtue. That same notion that examining the history of slavery and empire is divisive, that we should actively encourage ignorance on that and other subjects, that is exactly what the history warriors on this side of the Atlantic espouse. And at the center of all of this, the lightning rod for many of these debates, are statues. For most of my life, statues have been immensely boring. For the most part, we walk past them and barely take any notice of them. Suddenly, they have become invested with this incredible totemic power. And yet, the arguments used to defend statues collapse when basic historical research, when basic facts about the backstories of those statues and the men that they depict is engaged in, and they almost always are men. There are more statues of Queen Victoria than every other named woman in this country. There are more statues of nymphs and fairies than actual women. Let me give you a brief example. In 1774, Robert Clive, known as Clive of India, committed suicide. In 1857, he had led a British East India Company army, along with allies of the company, to a victory in Bengal against the Bengalis, but also against their French allies. He then embarked upon an absolutely astonishing spree of theft and looting. He diverted taxes in Bengal so that some of the wealth of one of India's richest provinces flowed into the pockets of himself and his band of East India Company followers. Their actions and their mismanagement of the economy of Bengal contributed to the outbreak of famine in 1769 and 1770 that led to an incredible number of people dying. The debate about how many died has been carried on ever since. When the news of Clive's death was made public, Samuel Johnson, the great diarist, the great intellectual, the inventor of the popularizer of the dictionary, a man who liked his cat, Hodge. Lots of nice things to say about Samuel Johnson, as well as the fact that in the house at the time was Francis Barber, his adopted, effectively son, a former slave. Samuel Johnson wrote this. He said of Clive that he had committed crimes that, quote, meant that his consciousness of them impelled him to cut his own throat. Indeed, Robert Clive was so hated, so reviled in 1774 that when he was buried, it was done in the middle of the night, and the body of this man, a billionaire in today's terms, was placed in an unmarked grave. So people of the time, viewing Robert Clive through the standards of the time, regarded him as a disgrace, the unacceptable face of 18th century capitalism, a man so corrupt that he stood out for corruption among the leaders of the East India Company, which in itself is quite an achievement. He was called Lord Vulture. He was mocked and lampooned in the press, from the stage, by cartoonists. He was hauled in front of Parliament and asked to account for his looting of Bengal and the cost in human lives. More than a century later, Lord Curzon, then Viceroy of India, set out to rehabilitate the reputation of Robert Clive. And he did so for political reasons rather than for historical reasons. He was seeking ways by which a new history of British rule in India could be forged, a history that would be useful, among other things, for resisting calls for Indian home rule. Thanks to Curzon's effort that was resisted and challenged by other members of the British elite, the statue of Robert Clive that today stands outside the Foreign Office was erected. A statue of a man who was widely reviled and condemned in his time by the people of his time who viewed him through the standards of their time. The moment history was rewritten was when that statue was commissioned and erected. It tells us nothing about Robert Clive, how he was viewed in his time, about his life, or the vast wealth he looted from India, and most importantly, like many statues, it is silent about the people who paid a price for his looting, the poor people of Bengal. It is silent about them as statues are almost always silent about the victims of the men they depict. The statue of Robert Clive says far more about Britain in the early 20th century and its attempts to rewrite history in order to strengthen its loosening grip on India than it does about Robert Clive or his life or his times in the mid and late 18th century. It tells us of how in the early 20th century imperialists sought to rehabilitate the story of Robert Clive to serve their political aims. like many statues, it certainly does have a history, but not the history that it pertains to tell us, not the history that its defenders claim that it tells us. There are similar and equally bizarre stories about a more famous statue, a statue that 2 years ago wasn't very famous. 4 years ago, I was making a documentary for a television channel, and we had a long debate about whether or not it made any sense to include a statue of this guy called Edward Colston, because no one out of Bristol had heard of him. It's not quite a problem we face anymore. The statue of Edward Colston, just like the statue of Robert Clive, does tell us a history, but not the history it pretends to tell us. Edward Colston died in 1721, rather conveniently, rather charmingly, in Black History Month. The statue was erected in 1895. It was erected by a merchant elite in Bristol who, for centuries, had been the dominant force in that city, but who were being usurped, who were being pushed to the margins by a new industrial elite. Bristol was going from being a port town to an industrial city, partly because of the mismanagement of the port by that same merchant elite and by the building of Avonmouth, a far more effective import facility. They chose a man from their past who had been a great philanthropist, though not the greatest philanthropist in Bristol's history, as a totem of their power around to build a cult in order to shore up their declining position in the city. They knew that Edward Colston was a slave trader. They just didn't care. They didn't care because they could not envisage a moment like the one I'm pleased to say we live in now, in which anyone would care about Colston's victims. That the fact that he had been a slave trader would be an issue. And so they erected a statue that recognized his philanthropy but was silent about the source of the vast bulk of his wealth. Edward Colston, as the statue will not tell you, was a share owner and the deputy governor, the modern equivalent of CEO of the Royal Africa Company, the company that transported more people into slavery than any in British history. During his period of involvement in the company, he was complicit in the enslavement of 84,000 people and the deaths of 19,000 men, women, and children. None of this is readable from that statue that stood on its pedestal for 125 years. The statue said instead a lot of half-truths. It said that Colston was a wise and virtuous son of the city. He was from Bristol. He spent most of his life in London. His slave trading actually has almost nothing to do with Bristol. He was a slave trader in the Royal Africa Company when it was a monopoly company and it traded out of London. It also claims that the statue was erected because of public subscription. There's lots of statues that claim to be erected because people gather together and put in their money. It's a lovely image of poor people coming back from mills and factories and mines and throwing a penny into the pot for the great industrialist, the great empire builder, the great slave trader. It wasn't erected on public subscription. The public subscription failed. Despite gathering together in repeated fundraising drives, the merchant elite of the city and their various societies, some of them dedicated to the memory of Colston, they could not raise the money for the statue, and it was most probably paid for by a guy called John Arrowsmith, who was the driving force, the man who had suggested the statue. Just like the statue outside Parliament of Oliver Cromwell, a man who the people of Ireland regard as someone who engaged in genocide, was not paid for by public subscription. It was paid for by one anonymous donor, Lord Rosebery, the Prime Minister, who unveiled the statue. The statue tells lies. It's untruthful. It is not a mechanism for telling us our history, as statues are never. It tells untruths, and most of all, just like the statue of Robert Clive, it is silent about those 19,000 people who died in the bellies of British slave ships in the 17th century, or the 84,000 sent to lives of enslavement in the New World. Statues aren't history. The whole argument that statues are somehow capable of recounting history, that they are a delivery system for historical knowledge, is refutable easily. Not only are statues incapable of performing that task, that is not what they were invented or deployed to do. History is fluid, it constantly changes, it's contexted, it's messy. Statues are simple. They say a simple message, and they cannot change. And history constantly changes. When historians are accused of rewriting history, that is their job. But also, history is dark and light. History is wonderful and terrible. Statues only ever tell one side of the story. Memorials can tell both, but they tend merely to remember the dead. Can we think of a figure who was hated in his lifetime, who committed terrible crimes or injustices, and who died as a villain, and for whom the people of a British city or town or any city thought, we should put a statue up to that guy? How are we going to remember his terrible crimes, his awful excesses? How are we going to imprint into our history how hated he was unless we put up a statue? Can we think of a man who was memorialized, that was part of an inglorious chapter of our past, a crime or a great failure, who our ancestors thought, we must remember these terrible failures, these awful crimes, by putting up a statue to this awful human being? Statues of named individuals are almost always heroic statues. They are forms not just of memorialization, but of validation. And they do not teach us our history, and they are incapable of doing so. There's a great example, which I'm very fond of that shows how incapable statues are of performing that task. If we think about what is the great memorial landscape in our country that I'm sure almost everybody in this room would have been to, it's Trafalgar Square in the centre of our capital. There are 7 statues in Trafalgar Square. Everyone can name one of them. It's pretty hard to miss, top of a 66-metre column. But how many of us can name one or all 6 of the others? If statues taught us our history, then everyone who had been to Trafalgar Square would be able to remember not just the names of those men cast in bronze and placed on pedestals in our most famous memorial landscape. We would have learnt some of the history of them. I've never met anyone who can name all 7 statues in Trafalgar Square. And ironically, the most famous statue in Trafalgar Square after Lord Nelson is an anti-statue. It's the empty 4th plinth, which is famous because it kind of works for who we are. It's moving, it's shifting, it reflects the dynamism of British art, one of our great cultural exports. It is an empty plinth that was built for some future great man who's not come along yet, that grabs our attention, that is evocative of the nation and the people that we really are. If statues told us our history, then Trafalgar Square would be a great place of education. But we don't learn history from statues. We learn it from books. We learn it at school. We learn it, I hope, from television programs. We learn it by going to heritage sites. We learn it by going to museums. Statues do not teach us our history because that is what they are incapable of doing, and that is not what they were erected in order to do. And the same is true of street names and buildings who are named after forgotten chapters of our past, or men who in many cases were involved in inglorious chapters of our past. They are not portals to our history. And if their names are changed, that does not involve the erasing of histories, because we don't, again, just like statues, we don't learn history from the names of buildings or the names of streets. If we did, everybody in this room could tell me all of the exciting details about the Battle of Portobello. There's a Portobello market in London. There's Portobello as an area of Edinburgh. There are Portobello streets all over this country. Anyone who'd ever walked down a Portobello street, or for that matter, eaten a Portobello mushroom, could tell me all about the details of that battle. But how many of us know the details of the Battle of Portobello? How many of us have had the details of that history imparted to us by a street name? The only reason I know is because a few years I was in Portobello, which is in Panama, and looked it up on my phone. I used to live in a street called Alma Roads. There were hundreds of Alma Roads and Alma Streets and Alma Mansions and Alma Cottages in Britain. None of them before 1854, but lots of them afterwards. We know the names, but we don't know the histories. Alma was a battle in the Crimean War. And it happened during an incredible building boom. So people were desperately looking, what are we going to call this new street? What are we going to call this block of houses? It doesn't translate. It doesn't work. The truth is that statues and street names are not history. Their removal, their changing of names does not represent an erasure of history nor the rewriting of history. And I think what many people have confronted and accepted in the past 18 months is that history comes to us rewritten. Much of our national history has been deliberately and carefully rewritten, and statues have been part of that process. Long before the statue of Edward Colston was toppled in Bristol, his history had been rewritten. It was rewritten by people who wanted us to remember him as a philanthropist, not as a slave trader. It was rewritten by people who wanted historical complexity and contradictions to be brushed under the historical carpet. It was rewritten by people who wanted us to remember abolition but forget slavery, who wanted us to remember the abolitionists, but not the black people themselves, the enslaved people who fought for their own freedom, with petitions and biographies and narratives when they could, with swords and muskets when they had no choice. It was rewritten by people who wanted us to remember Hans Sloane as a great collector, the man whose collection became the nucleus for our National Museum, the British Museum, but to ignore the fact that some of the wealth that used to buy that collection came from the murderous exploitation of commoditized human beings on the slave plantations owned by his wife, and that he himself was an investor in slave trading companies. Even if taken on their own terms, the arguments of the new history warriors fall apart. In reaction to calls to remove statues from public display and into museums, where they can properly be contextualized, has emerged arguments that instead they should be left on public display and contextualized there, retain and explain. Somehow, the moving of statues into museums entails the erasure of history. If moving objects into museums and putting them on public display is the erasure of history, museums are the most destructive places we've ever created. They are responsible for the erasure of the vast bulk of our history, and they should all be closed down. Yet when the British Museum did exactly this and took the bust of Hans Sloane off public display in 2020 and placed it in a glass case surrounded by extra information and extra artifacts explaining that the source of much of Sloane's wealth came from his wife's plantations in Jamaica, the museum was attacked and criticized. But surely Hans Sloane, now surrounded by more history, not less, had been both retained and better explained. The British Museum was even accused, ridiculously, of unfairly locking Hans Sloane in a glass case. If Hans Sloane's case is the only one in the British Museum that is locked, the British Museum Security Department have some serious operational problems. It's never seemed to me a very good idea to test whether the glass cases in the British Museum are locked. But I suspect Hans Sloane has not been singled out for vindictive treatment. And right now, in Bristol, the city I was in this morning, the statue of Edward Colston is on his back in a museum, surrounded by information that was not accessible when he towered over a city that is 14% minority, when he loomed over the ancestors of his victims on public display, validated. History is not being erased. History is being added to by these processes. And the reason for these contradictions is that these arguments are false arguments. They are disingenuous. They're designed to muddy the water and to slander the opposition. This is a battle over what history is and what it is not. Is history a place we go to be challenged as well as exhilarated? If we feel pride about the great achievements of our ancestors, why shouldn't we feel shame about their terrible crimes? Although I have to say, my own personal view is that both pride and shame are inappropriate prisms through which to view the actions of men and women who lived long before we were born. Or is history a repository of comforting myths we use to make ourselves feel comfortable and believe in the magical exceptionalism of Britain, even in the face of evidence that we are, no matter what we want to believe, a nation with obviously, inevitably inglorious as well as wonderful chapters to our past? Statues are the totems selected by those who are determined to defend national mythology and privilege it over national history. And if in order to defend those myths, historians and even history itself is to be attacked and discredited, then, according to them, so be it. They seek to shore up notions of exceptionalism, ideas that have long prevented us from confronting difficult facts and painful truths about what our nation has been and what it has done, and how those histories continue to shape our modern society and our relationships with one another. Now, I'm not one of those figures from the left who rejects the idea that cancel culture exists. I think there is a battle for academic freedom and freedom of thought going on within our society, and that we do need to find ways to live together while holding opposing views. But the great falsehood of our times is that this culture, this cancel culture, is a feature only of the left. Cancelling is exactly what the history warriors and the culture warriors are engaged in. They seek to cancel aspects of the past that disrupt their mythologies. They are willing to attack the reputations of historians and damage the reputations and the health of national institutions, both materially and professionally. Whatever it takes to defend myths of British exceptionalism, they are willing to engage. They are willing to engage in. And they will engage in the reputation laundering of men who committed terrible crimes, but are important to maintaining those myths about British history. They're also involved in perpetuating another falsehood about British history, which is that we alone in this country get to decide how those histories are remembered. That we alone get to decide whether the empire, for example, was a force for good or a force for ill in the world. That is a myth, and an arrogant one, because our most contested histories are not just contested among ourselves, they are contested between ourselves and the other nations around the world who in the past were drawn into the orbit of Britain in the age of empire. Britain's remarkable history is so extensive, so global. The British history is not merely the story of the people who today live on these islands, and our history cannot be a monologue. It must be a dialogue with the hundreds of millions of people around the world who have shared chapters of their history and our history. Opposition to those engaged in the history wars is not about being woke. It is not about fashion. It is not about wanting people to feel shame or guilt. It is about some very simple questions. Should we, uncritically, celebrate the lives of men who committed terrible crimes and conspire in the erasure of their victims merely because our ancestors, or a very small minority of our ancestors, chose to erect statues to them? Once erected, are statues frozen forever? Can we never change our mind? Can we never reassess, rethink, no matter what we learn? Should we edit out of our national history that which makes us feel uncomfortable? Should we really want to know less rather than more about the past? The great smoke and mirrors trick of the culture war is to argue that the history of people like me, 14% of the population whose family histories are linked to the colonial past, is somehow a threat to British history. That these histories, black history, the history of the empire, slavery, and of the violence of the empire, is a threat to British history. The truth is, those histories are British history. My history is your history. The history of one side of my family who struggled in the factories of Newcastle and Glasgow in the 19th century is part of the history of the other half of my family who encountered British power in Nigeria after the 1850s. My history is your history. The job of an historian is to uncover the past, not to use the past as a source of comforting myths. Thank you very much. See, I've done what I normally do. I said I'd talk for 35 minutes and it was 50. Rather like my books, I say they're going to be 100,000 words and they end up 200,000. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm so sorry to have trespassed on your time.
If you could put your hands up, there's one over there. We've got mics both sides. There's one over there for Felicity and I've got one down here afterwards.
Hello, David. Do you think the war on history is being orchestrated by a particular institution or group of people, or is it a more organic bubbling up from all different directions?
Thank you. I think it's something that works in the short term, and if you could characterize British politics for the past 50 years, short-termism would be irrespective of which party it is, would be at the forefront of your thinking. It seems to work for some people some of the time. I think the problem with it, and this is where I have hope, is that it doesn't work with young people. So if I was a long-term political strategist, I'm not sure we have any long-term political strategists in this country, I'd be really, really worried about this because young people they don't buy this. They don't, and for reasons I do not understand, and I see this in my students, they do not look to history only to be comforted. It's unsurprising, I think, that a generation for whom the prospects of house ownership, for whom the continued existence of the polar ice caps is not guaranteed, that this is not the snowflake generation that wants to be told comforting tales. Their lives aren't comforting. They look at the environmental damage that they're going to have to sort out if we give them enough time. And they are not a frivolous snowflake generation. They're a generation who are used to putting their hand in the fire of uncomfortable facts, and they don't look to history for comforting myths. So in the long term, I think it's a foolish strategy, but I think it has some way to run yet. Hi.
Hi. Okay.
Sorry, that was my fault. Forgive me. Hi there.
What do you see as the value of individual family documents, please?
Well, I was going to lie there. I was almost in tears. I was in tears at the National Archives, the Office for National Statistics, looking at the 1921 census, seeing my great-grandfather, who of course I never met, seeing their signatures on the census. There's a quote all historians love by Trevelyan, and he talks about the quasi-miraculous fact of history is that we occupy a space that our ancestors occupied, that we walk in the same streets. And sometimes, the power of a family document is just overwhelming. The bit I love in making House of the Time, that series I have the privilege to present, is when we can show somebody a document that has their ancestors' handwriting on. And if they aren't in tears, I'm in tears. It's immensely powerful. This genealogy revolution that's now sort of into its kind of second, third decade is just enormous. Millions of people around the world have engaged in this process to encounter their ancestors. There was a time, this is not true anymore, but there was a time that the only thing that got more internet traffic than genealogy was pornography. And, that's an unlikely second place. But it shows the power. We're drawn to it. This is why house histories are so powerful. And this is why House of the Times had 4 series. It's because if you live in an old house, if you have any imagination, you think, what happened in these rooms? Who lived here? What did they do? That moment when you're decorating and you find the old wallpaper and you think about who put it up, or what stage in their life, were they waiting for children? Were they just got married? Did they just moved in? Were they going through the same emotions that we were going through when that house became our house? Man, if you can't feel their presence at those moments, you're a statue.
I'm trying to gather my thoughts again. Do you think it's beginning to finally dawn on British society that there were other people there during all these histories? That actually in all those countries, in all those cultures, in all those buildings and all the things that are pointed to that the empire built. And it came to mind when I was standing in Dublin with a friend of mine saying to me, but they left so much. And I said, if they hadn't ever come, we'd have built it ourselves, and it might have been better. And that concept that actually there were places where people could have had their own cultures and their own, and that was as important and as superior, that concept is missing when you're talking about history sometimes. There's something superior and right about British history and who wrote it, and the lived experience of those who experienced it during the generations is entirely absent. And I wonder whether you think that time has come as well.
I hope so, but I think the big phenomena of British history is amnesia. We just remember so little. I mean, I can tell from your accent and the mention of Dublin that you're from the Republic. I mean, there's a phrase, which I'm sure you know, G.K. Chesterton's famous quote, "The problem about the Irish is they never forget. The problem about the English is they never remember." We just have this amnesia about the past. I have a habit back when I had a life and got on aeroplanes and went places. If I was landing in a transit, in an airport lounge, I would just look up the history of that place just to see whether the British ever invaded. It's my little parlour game, just out of interest. And so often, even as an historian, there are British incursions that I didn't know about. I was in Montevideo just before the pandemic and looked it up. Yeah, the British invaded. I've forgotten the name of the historian, but they calculated which, obviously it's complicated because not all countries still exist and borders change, but this estimation was, I think there was 59 countries in the world that Britain hasn't invaded. There was about 200 countries in the world. And some of that 59 include, the Vatican and Greenland. And they were always going to be kind of low on the list of priorities. It's going to take quite a lot for Greenland to get to the top of the list. And this is not, again, to make us feel bad or to self-flagellate. It's just our history is incredibly global. And it is the histories of other people. And we just can't pretend that this little England version of our past makes sense. I mean, the lack of what we know about our relationship with Ireland is unbelievable. And it was only when I went to university and I had Irish friends that I understood that I knew nothing. And I had lived through the Troubles as a kid growing up. And I didn't understand what all this was about because that history was just not present in what I was taught. And yet my friends who were in Northern Ireland and my friends from the Republic, this history, not only was it taught in their schools, it was their lives. How can we have a country where we don't know the 500-year contested, terrible, complex, bitter history of our closest neighbour? It's barely taught in our schools. How can we vote about big decisions that might affect the borders between that country and our country without that history? We don't know it. The biggest immigrant group in this country's history has always been the Irish, and yet that history it's terrifying how little we know about it. So we have a selective memory, but the overriding story is complete amnesia. We remember almost nothing. I had somebody attacking me online saying, why don't I go back to Nigeria? Why are the Nigerians in Britain? Well, ask Lord Palmerston. If you have a problem with Nigerians in Britain, you need to build a time machine, go back to 1851, and talk Lord Palmerston out of attacking the city I was born in Lagos, in Nigeria. It's a bit late. Thank you.
Hi. I suppose following on a bit from the questions you've already been asked, I'm a primary school teacher who has sadly only recently, I would say in the last 2 years, realised that I have been engaged in British amnesia, in school history, which is not teaching our children anything that they need to know. And I just wondered, have you got any tips? I know there's a few primary school teachers probably here today. Any tips for us in how we rectify that, how we change that as best we can without us being accused of rewriting history and not doing our jobs properly?
Thank you. Thank you. I would say what was deliberately misquoted in the Times earlier this week is that I don't think there's a political will to change the curriculum at the moment in England, though that has just happened in Wales. But I think we need to do it ourselves. I think there are new resources. The publishing industry is publishing more books about imperial history and black history than it ever has before. And I just constantly meet young teachers who are dedicated to not allowing the curriculum to be a prison that prevents them from teaching histories that are more relevant to the family histories of the children that they teach. I think this new generation of teachers and the new generations of resources available to them is the place where we can affect change now while we wait for politics to catch up with demographics. Thank you.
David, are you able to take one more?
Sure, of course.
Can I just ask you, do you think British politics is so fragile that we can't deal with our colonial history? Discussions about Brexit, all those other things, it's as though we're not allowed to know these things because we can't manage that terrible background that we have to so many of our supposed great glories.
Thank you. I think it's more fundamental. I think it's about what is history for? And if history is a place to go to feel good about yourself, and always to be told comforting stories, always to be told that we were on the side of the angels, if history exists as a form of recreation, then you have to take out of history everything that doesn't work for that function. I think it comes at that very fundamental question about what is the function of history. If history is recreation, then it has to be made to feel recreational. And the problem with that is that it means taking out chapters that are true but uncomfortable. And many of those chapters explain the backstories and the family stories of 14% of our population. Going to be 30% of the population of England by one estimate by the middle of the century. That's not a history that works for the country that we are now or the country that we're going to be in the middle of this century. It works for a sort of imagined 1950s Little England. What is history for? We expect other countries to look at their history and learn lessons and to think deeply. We expect that of Germany. We expect that of Japan. Now, I have to say at this point, just in case there's someone from the Daily Mail and I'm not comparing British and German history, because even when I say that, they still quote it as if I haven't said that. So, boringly, I need to say that. But I am comparing our relationship with our history to other countries. We expect other countries. And we can look at other people's histories and we can say, why can't they see it? Most people in this country can look at the deep south of America and say, why are you asking 13% of the population, 40 million African Americans, to live under the shadow of slave owners, Confederate generals, men involved in terrible crimes? We can see that. When it's our own history, there's this blind spot. And it is about comfort and discomfort. Well, history doesn't exist to make us feel good. I'm really sorry. I'd be more popular if it did. But that's not the job of historians. And history just can't do that if you're going to be honest about history. Sorry.
Thank you, David, so much. Thank you for your generosity and your time and in coming to Shoreham by Sea. You've made a huge impact, so thank you very much. This event has been recorded and will be on our website, so if you want to go back and watch it again, please do, and keep the debate going. We've got another debate here in the same room on Friday the 15th, where we've got Katie Balls and Stephen Bush, different perspectives, and another opportunity to have a little debate amongst ourselves about what's going on in the world. Wordfest carries on until the 17th of October, and you're very welcome to join us in our final party on that day. So thank you again to David.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.